Okay, I know a few people are still wandering in, but we might get going. Because it's great to be back in Cornwall. I wonder how many people are local? How many people live and work in Cornwall here? Okay, well, not as many as I thought then. Okay, well, for me, I'm not local, but by coincidence, this is actually my third time on this particular university campus. This is where my son, who's just completed his A-levels, is hoping, all going well with his results, is going to come and do a geography degree. So I've actually been here a couple of times, but it's nice to be back here. But there's also, I guess, a historical and cultural connection. If you're wondering about my accent, it's a slight hybrid. I live in the Cotswolds now, but I'm from Australia, specifically South Australia. And South Australia has had a long history of Cornish immigration. So the South Australian tin mining boom took place, I think, as the Cornish tin mining boom was starting to bust, and so we had a large influx of Cornish men and women coming to South Australia over the years. There's even, I think I've got it here as proof, there's even a town called Truro. Where can we spot it? I think there you go. That's outback South Australia. If we joined up the rest of this, then yeah, Perth would be somewhere over there, and Sydney would be over by the exits. So Adelaide is just to the south, just off the bottom there. Truro, South Australia, is famous, or rather infamous, in Australia. It's known as the place, well, at least since 1980, it was known as the place where a rather grisly set of mass murders took place. So Truro was kind of the murder capital of South Australia for a while. And of course, you know, quite unfairly on the people of Truro, most of them were good law-abiding folk. Only one of them was a serial killer. But yeah, they suffered this stigma right up until about the year 2000, when I think they sort of overcame that because there was a worse serial killing in a different town called Snowtown. And Snowtown is also in South Australia, I'm afraid. You follow the A1, you keep going north, you hit a little small place called Snowtown. And again, it's famous only for being where a bunch of bodies were found in barrels of acid. And it's, again, even worse than Truro. It was really unfair because Snowtown had nothing to do with those incidents. Nobody from Snowtown was murdered. The grisly murders never took place in Snowtown. The psychopath who was the perpetrator didn't live in Snowtown. It just happened to be where the police found these barrels of decomposing bodies in acid because the guy happened to rent out a disused bank in Snowtown. So it became the unfortunate, it took the mantle from Truro of being the place that everyone knows in South Australia as being where mass murders take place. As I say, quite unfairly so, because the murderer and the murders all took place down here in this place called Elizabeth, which, again, another South Australian country town. These days, it's pretty much considered a northern suburb of Adelaide. It's a pretty depressing post-industrial wasteland, high crime area, considered no-go area. And yeah, that's where all the so-called bodies in the barrel murders took place. That's where I'm from, Elizabeth. So now you know my connection to Cornwall, where the common link is mass murders in South Australia. But that's not what we're here to talk about. What I am going to talk about is the problem that I see a lot in the sort of consulting work I do with various companies, helping people, helping product owners and other team members get to grips with how they create and articulate and record their user stories. By way, I guess, of a little bit of advertising, we've written a book called 50 Quick Ideas to Improve Your User Stories. We, being myself and my more well-known co-author, Gojko Adzic. Now, in that book, we have a chapter that says, look, don't obsess about story format. Don't worry about how you express the written form of your stories. Choose whatever works for you and move on. The more important thing is the telling of the story, the communication that goes on between a product owner and their team, and the way we write the story really doesn't matter as long as you're achieving that goal. And that advice still stands. But I have found that since the book came out, lots of people are still saying, yeah, but what should I write down? So this is kind of the 51st chapter, if you like, for that book, which is going to give you a little bit of specifics about, if you're still struggling with the way you write down stories, here are some tips to help out. But we're going to start, since we're in University of Falmouth, it's a music and arts university, we're going to start with a little music quiz. So the way this works is I'm going to show you the lyrics of a song that I think you'll know, but I don't know how quickly you'll detect it. Now, what you're not allowed to do is shout it out, okay? When you know it, don't say it, don't even whisper it to the person next to you because you want to feel smug that you were the first. But do, for my purposes, just raise your hand when you recognize it. And I think we'll all get there, but I just want to see what the rate of recognition is. So I'm starting just with the first verse, okay? Yep, a few people hit it straight away. It's a little impenetrable to some others. Some people are guessing, okay, yeah, you're thinking, okay, maybe if I give you a few more. Yes, it does involve the chorus, so some people should start to recognize this. Will it help if I give you the opening riff? Yeah, okay. Get ready for the headbanging bit. Okay. So it Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, and most of you should know it by now. It's a song that's kind of entered rock folklore, I guess. For many people like me, this has got the starting point of grunge, if you like. It was a pretty influential song. It still remains one of my favorites, and many other people like it. But if you don't like this song, well, you're actually in fairly good company. Famously, Kurt Cobain hated it. And it's kind of not hard to understand why. I mean, this quote from when he had to sing this at a concert in Seattle, only 2 years after the song was written, mind, and not all that long before he sadly took his own life. He makes this kind of comment. He said, "This is the song that ruined our lives and ruined Seattle and ruined your lives too." Until this point, Nirvana were a small but locally respected indie band that had a dedicated fan following, very, very popular live act in the sort of small circle in which they operated. But this was the song that sort of catapulted them out of that and into the whole MTV craziness that clearly Kurt Cobain struggled to cope with thereafter. So that was Kurt Cobain talking about the reaction to the song in 1994. Now, roll the clock forward 20 years. The poor guy is turning in his grave. This is a song that's been covered by all sorts of pretty unlikely artists. There's sort of the Miley Cyrus one is sort of somewhat famous, but by God, it's not the worst. I've researched this. There are far worse covers than Miley Cyrus's cover of this song. What else? Look. I mean, here's a genuine ad from New Look, telling you how you can get the grunge look. It's fairly straightforward. Step 1 is be thin and gorgeous. Step 2 is to get some fairly expensive leather accessories. Step 3 is to play with your hair a bit. And optionally tie a check flannel shirt around your waist or something like that. And there you go. The likeness, it's pretty incredible. They've really got Kurt Cobain's look just down pat. Yes, it's become a travesty, as I say. The success or the over-popularity of the song at the time was enough to drive Kurt Cobain to despair. But it's become far worse since. And if you really want to, waste a couple of minutes of your life, I suggest Google for Paul Anka. He's this sort of crooner that does this bizarre version that you can't unhear. So be warned, if you do look it up, yes, you'll never forget it. Well, why do I bring this up? Why am I telling you this? It's because Kurt Cobain's relationship to something profound and good that he created is a little similar to something else that I come across a lot. Yeah, this is the template that ruined our lives and ruined Agile, and will ruin your life too if you continue to use this slavishly like a template zombie. I'm sure your backlogs have got sort of stories like this. This is the sort of nonsense that I see all the time. Is presumed solutions that are masquerading as something that our users are actually clamoring for us to implement. Well, nobody wants to be locked out after 3 incorrect password attempts, so why are we continuing to pretend that that really is a story that a user of ours would tell? So I'm going to give you a bit of advice that helps us sort of get past that problem. That's the thing that I want to address. But I'm going to start with, I guess, some important information about the relationship between stories and the effect we're trying to bring about in the world. And so that's this topic of influence and control. By the way, this slide builds, and if you're sort of tempted to take a photograph at some point, and there's always one thing else to come, and then you get annoyed, I'll put a little camera icon at the end just so that you'll know that it's a good photo opportunity. I'm indebted to Dan North. I always give him credit for this. Is Dan actually in the room? No? Okay, he's got better things to do, obviously. He wrote a great blog post, which I think it was titled, Whose Domain Is It Anyway? But his central premise is that for every story there is, well, at least 2 domains, or 2 important domains. There's the business domain and there's the technical domain. And we really need to recognize that what aspects of the story sort of sit in each of those domains. So the business domain is kind of where we might put what you would call the requirement. I hesitate to use that term. I don't like the word requirement. It is a bit overloaded, and I think it can be misinterpreted. But think of it as anything that really exists or germinates in the domain of the business. So it could be a good idea for something that we think is going to have value. It might be a direct need that is being asked of us from the marketplace, or it might be some problem with the way things are at the moment that we believe people would see value if we can fix or improve that problem. And all of that sort of is the why and the who of the story. It's why would we invest time in doing something in the first place, and who is it that we expect to benefit from this? Now that domain sort of intersects or interacts with our technical domain via the conversation that we have as a team, or as people who are responsible for technical solutions and those that understand the business requirement. So that conversation is what genders or what creates solution options. And I always say options because there are multiple options that go with any given requirement. It's not a one-to-one relationship. What we might do is we might settle upon something that we think is good enough to say, here's the design that we're going to try. I would call that the design sketch. So in terms of stories, that's probably as much as we need to do, is to provide a sketch of what we think is the solution. The story itself, the details will unfold as we explore that story. But indeed, that design sketch involves things like estimates of how complicated this is, how costly is it, what's our, all the talks concerning cost of delay come into here. So here's one option. Maybe we can compare that with other options that might not deliver as much value, but give us a shorter implementation time. All that changes the economics of our equation about what's worth doing at any given time. So it never really stops at our first solution. We always sort of use that as input to further conversation about what else is worth trying. And that is the what part of the story. Now, there's another couple of points to make here. Firstly is that the story is sort of something that's complete or whole when we've been able to bring those things together. But therefore, the story doesn't start whole. It doesn't start with these things magically, merging together. The story unfolds as a process of having this conversation and exploring those options. So it's okay to call a story even before we know what the solution is. That is the point. We're working through the story to see how it ends. The other thing that's important about these domain distinction is that the business domain is really about the things that we can influence, whereas the technical domain is about things that we can control. So we talk about the business domain is about things out there in the world. And Jeff Patton has this nice phrase. He said, what's the reason we do software development? Is to change the world. So the world is a particular way now. We want to change the way it is in future when we've implemented something. So the objective is not the delivery of software. It's not changing the output of what our system does. The objective is changing the outcome for people who are using our software. We're trying to improve people's lives. But the point is that that's something we don't have direct control over. We don't have our hands on that lever. We can observe, but we really only have our hands on the lever of the technical domain. So the things that we do in the what part of our story are things that we can control. But by doing that, we say, okay, what impact did that have out there in the world? And I do just enough experimentation to see, did it have the impact I wanted? Did it move the dials in the right direction? If not, okay, maybe I should pull this out, reverse it, try a different experiment. Oh, sorry, and there's your, there's the last part of the build. Okay, but we've mentioned who, what, and why. Well, that's where we come back to this template that I sort of have so much objection to. But like any retrospective, you always start with, well, what was good before you look at what you could improve. So what's good about the so-called Connextra template, as I want, so that? Well, I like the fact that it does give us a who, what, and why. These are the three essential things that we want to identify and understand, and it gives it to us in a nice single sentence. So what can be wrong with that? Where our who is a role or an actor or other stakeholder, what is the solution or change that we want to implement, and the why is the value or the business benefit. So that's so far so good. The problem is, even for a very short structure like this, we fall victims of the fact that the elements of that, the who, what, and why, are in the wrong order. So, I don't own the phrase, but I use it a lot, start with why. You'll hear that advice all the time in all sorts of different contexts. So why not do that with stories? Start with the why. Don't start with what and then try to, pass off some kind of excuse as a why after the fact. So, therefore, what are some alternatives? Well, the simplest thing, the simplest improvement, is one that I believe is credited to Chris Matz. And he simply said, well, yeah, put the why first by changing the so that to in order to, and then put your statement of your problem or the thing that you think is valuable as the first thing, and then the rest remains the same as a I want. So it's the minimal change that I think addresses that fundamental issue of starting with why. There's another sort of very terse one that I quite like. It's almost about as minimalist as you can get. There's only sort of 2 extra template words in there, which is to why, who needs what. So I quite like that. It's, as I say, it's still got the why, the who, and the what in the correct order, and the minimum scaffolding you could possibly imagine around it. the one that I tend to use is this. So I keep Chris's starting point. So I say in order to and put the why. Then I say for somebody, so for a stakeholder, we will do something. So the for and the we is about making an honest and explicit separation between somebody else in our sphere of influence is the beneficiary here. We want to make life better for somebody. We want to solve somebody's problem. But they probably aren't directly asking for that. The we in this context is we a software team, or we an organization. So we are choosing to do something with the expectation, with the hope, with the wish that this brings a benefit for somebody in our sphere of influence. But it makes it clear that this is not something that people are asking for. It's very, very rare that the first person style of user stories as a somebody, I want something, it's very rare that we get requirements that are actually like that. I think good software and good design is a bit like good service in a restaurant. It's all those things that happen without you asking for it that leads to a good experience. So good software is about finding the things that our users will be delighted by, or that makes, reduces the friction in their jobs without them having to ask for it, without them having to come up with what might be a good feature. And indeed, the systems that are built basically from going out and asking a bunch of users what they want actually aren't necessarily the most successful systems. So it's just being conscious that we are utilizing the good product management and design skills that we have, and we're doing it for people in our sphere of influence. The next problem is the difference in level of expression, or the level of problem that we're talking about when describing the why versus the what. And for this, we rely on sort of the lesson of the underpants gnomes. Who's familiar with the meme of the underpants gnome? Okay, only a few. It's always worth sort of putting this into your kit bag of knowledge. So just to give you some background here, this particular scene from South Park, and surprisingly, so there's no swearing in this, just in case you're worried. Very rare to find a 1-minute clip with no swearing in it from South Park. So there's a character called Tweak, who's a sort of nervy kid, is losing his underpants overnight. They're all disappearing from his room, and he believes it's the underpants gnomes that are stealing them. So he and his friends hatch a plan to stay up and catch them in action, which is exactly what happens. So they follow the gnomes back to their lair. And the thing about the gnomes in South Park is that they are considered the business geniuses. Okay, so these are the guys who sort of have this master plan for how to sort of make a stonky amount of money. And this is where they sort of get some insight into the business nous of the gnomes. Now I might have to pause a little bit. It will come. We tested this a moment ago.
This is where all our work is done. So what are you going to do with all these underpants that you steal? Collecting underpants is just phase 1. Phase 1, collect underpants. So what's phase 2? Hey, what's phase 2? Phase 1, we collect underpants. Yeah, but what about phase 2? Well, phase 3 is profit. Get it?
I don't get it.
You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit.
And so over the internet, you'll see lots of ... profit references. Well, that's talking about this. That's where there is an utter mismatch between the somewhat arbitrary activity that we're pursuing now with the sort of rather vague justification that doing so actually leads to profit. And clearly the phase 2 is always the missing link. There's no logical connection between what we're doing and how that actually leads to profit. So this is a problem that we see a lot in user stories. So the why is the business value. So you'll see people that say, well, I want to collect underpants so that profit. You know, that's where we get the problem of a very low-level what, a very sort of granular and low-level so-called solution, and a vastly inflated high-level why of we'll profit from this. However, the more common problem that I see is the opposite problem. Rather than the problem of too great a separation in level between what and why, the problem is where those things flatten out such that there's no room in between them. So that might be characterized as an underpants gnome. I want to collect underpants so that I have a collection of underpants. So there's this presumed value that's just, you know, reworded out of the thing that we're doing. So, you know, that's the most common problem that I see, is where, you know, your so that is really just a bolt-on that implies that there's obvious value in the thing that we are doing, and so it's just a lazy rewording. And so the kind of problems that creates is that it means that somebody thinks that this solution of this story is not under question. It's a foregone conclusion. It's not something that's up for negotiation. And there's certainly no need for any team to provide any good ideas, because, you know, here's the solution, and it's defined to be valuable. Okay, so that's the first problem that I want to deal with, the who, what, and why. The next thing that I'm going to show you is about if we've elevated the importance of why to being something that I want to declare first, then, you know, we need some help with how we do that. And I'm quickly reminding you of this one to show, well, this is another reason why we want the sequence of those elements of the story phrase to be in the order that they are. Because we shouldn't even be thinking about the solution until we've understood the problem. And some good advice that I've heard, and it's a nice experiment to try, I do recommend it, is if you're a product owner or you're advising product owners in your organization, they will always be tempted, even if they sort of change the order around, to say, okay, I've got, in order to, here's my problem statement, here's my value statement, we will do some solution. Try taking that to the team without the solution. So just let the product owner present the why, and then see what solution ideas the team comes up with. Now, it may be that matches the idea that you already had, but they might come up with better ideas. So I'm a realist. It's very, very rare that people will just describe the problem without already having some kind of idea for a solution in their head. What I am suggesting is that resist the temptation to assume that's the best solution. So keep it in the back of your mind or in your back pocket, present the problem to the team, see what solutions they come up with, and see how well that matches what you thought was the right thing to do. Okay, so I'm going to introduce an idea called a value map, and it's a tool for how we might sort of articulate and navigate the why part of our stories. Its origin comes in part from, again, I mentioned Chris Matz again. He was the one who also said that our projects are really probably about one of these three things. It's either about reducing costs, increasing revenue, or the surprising one, it might be about protecting revenue. So that's where we are not necessarily creating any new source of income, but we're finding ways to make sure that our current source of income is protected. So it's either things that sort of keep us competitive, or it's things that sort of raise the barrier for competitors to enter the market, so things that would prevent them stealing a march on us, or it's about being, improving what we've got as opposed to creating new sources of revenue. So I quite liked that idea, but I also thought, well, when I saw those three things, I wanted to sort of go one better. Also, I saw a matrix sort of crying to reveal itself. So it's really these things are about revenue and they're about costs, but they're also about current and future. So costs are essentially something that we have at the moment that we want to try and minimize, and revenue is something that we want to get more of. So one's a current thing, one's a future thing. But as Chris points out, protection is about revenue, but about current revenue, and therefore the obvious missing piece is about costs that we don't yet incur, but we could incur if we didn't do something about them. So it's about avoiding future costs is the fourth element of this, this puzzle. So I was pleasantly surprised. If you were in Aussie Yuka's talk this morning, she showed exactly this model. No accusations of plagiarism. I think these good ideas just kind of float around the world, and also it's not a particularly radical thing to come up with. But it was nice to see that this, as an idea, is taking root in various places. Now, what I like to do is to use those things as the start of a hierarchy of value dials. You know, that's the things that I would want to be able to measure in my organization to understand what really is the source of profit and value in our context. Now, if I just left it at that, you know, I wouldn't win any business consultancy awards to say, okay, to improve profit, you know, concentrate on these four things. Therefore, the value map is all about what happens at the next level. Because as soon as I want to drill into each of these, I get into something that's context specific for your business. So here's an example that happened to be from an organization that was in the fund management space. So their top line, their increase in new revenue, was really about measuring or focusing on two measurable things. Growing their total assets under measurement, you could put a number on that, and the bigger that number gets, the more money for them, and also growing the fees they charge on their investors. So for each, for the profit that their clients make, they charge a fee. They can choose to increase that arbitrarily, or they could choose to reduce it. Those will have a direct effect on their revenue. In their context, the idea of protecting current revenue was all about client satisfaction. It was essentially a competitive marketplace. What they do is common to what many other fund management firms do, and therefore unhappy customers will go elsewhere. So protecting was, you know, almost directly linked to their measures of client satisfaction. Again, in their context, future costs is all about making sure you're not in breach of financial regulations. So compliance with the rules and things they might get fined or slapped over the wrist with, that was all about avoiding future costs. And therefore, the rest of their profit was really driven by what is their cost of operation. So reducing current costs was really the fat part of their map here, because that provided the greatest opportunity for improvement through IT. So as we go through these things, you can expand on these ad infinitum. And that's perhaps an important thing to state, is that when you're working with a value map, the idea is not to say, okay, I've got to get my business people to sit down and create this, and then when that's done, we're ready to move on and create our backlog of stories. That's really not the point. It's an analytical tool that helps you explore the value of the things that are potential things to do. So you expand kind of on demand. You expand to understand, what's the area that we need to improve, and how well do we need to understand the detail of it. So you can go on as far as you like, as I say, about sort of for the avoiding IP type issues, things that are specific to this business we'll exclude, but they'll all come down to something that involves specific processes in your organization, and then you'll probably have common things like, well, what's the cycle time on this given process, and what's the elements that we see within this. So you can go, as I say, as far as deep as you need, depending on how much or what's the opportunity that I have to make improvement? So if you believe you've got a story that's all about sort of, well, just, I don't know, reducing the number of user steps in a given process, and you don't need to sort of divide that any further, then you would just say, this story, the value dial of this story is about reducing the number of user steps in process X. And I can automate something that means I simplify that, and that directly reduces cycle time. But I can also say, well, okay, but how much of an influence does that have on cycle time? If I know that's the thing that I want to optimize, but I can do all I like reducing this, but maybe it's the amount of rework that already happens. So maybe there's a particular step that is the problematic one, that we're always finding that somebody does some process that goes through some review, and then people end up having to do rework on there. So you focus on what is the greatest opportunity to make improvement. As I say, the size of these things can become very, very big. And it's not the purpose to sort of go for completeness. It's to go for exploration. That's why it's a map. It's saying, what are the areas of unknown in our business? What do I need to explore, or what do I need to understand and map out so that we can navigate the potential value in that area? So you'll find these things sort of grow over time, but you only need to sort of look at the detail that's relevant to the area that you're going to navigate or explore in a given story. And the nodes themselves are things that you can then directly associate with a story as part of your definition of why you believe there's something valuable to be done here. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can either sort of make a direct reference in your in order to stage, or the why part of your story. You can sort of take that sort of as a direct reference to an item or a node in your map, or you can phrase the why whichever you like, and then you can say, here are the dials that I would expect to move, or here are the things that I would expect to see improvements on. Because it might be that any one solution actually affects multiple dials of value in your map. So yeah, here our example is about a process for creating some kind of quotation. So we're saying in order to reduce double keying, for risk analyst modeling a quote, we'll pre-populate data from the quote. And we've got this extra phase, whereas currently this is copied manually. So we'll come on to why we've got that little extra phrase in a second. So, quite often when we are proposing a change, so we've looked at a tool to help with the why, that's the thing we discussed first. Now we're into the realm of the what. So we've settled upon a solution that we believe is the right thing to do, that's going to move one or more of our dials on the value map in the correct direction. But we now need to sort of understand and estimate the implications of a given solution. And it's not always obvious how complex or how big that solution is if we don't know what sort of change it represents from where we are today. So that's where an additional phrase can be helpful, where you state explicitly what is the change from the way things work at the moment as a way of adding information to your what class. So this is adding a whereas currently phrase to the end of your story. So as an example, well, let's say this story, again, also from the trading domain. So the story is, in order to optimize trading while avoiding breaching regulations, for a trader, we will warn them when trading volume reaches 80% of their daily trading limit. So the question is, well, how much work is that? What's the size of that as a story? Well, it all depends on what the current situation is. So if you're not already intimately familiar with the way the system behaves at the moment, you couldn't really make a judgment about how big that particular story is. So let's consider, I've lost a little bit of the bottom space there. Let's consider these possibilities. It might be that the first situation is that there's no concept in our system, or at least no automated way of checking our traders' daily limits. It's probably just something that eventually gets reported upon, and then somebody goes and checks that, and somebody says, you actually exceeded what was your regulations, and we get hit with a fine after the fact. So maybe that's the worst case situation. We don't have any control over policing those daily limits in an automated way. In which case, there's a huge amount of work to do, because you're starting from scratch there, aren't you? But what if the solution at the moment is that, well, yes, we do enforce the daily trading limit, but it's a hard stop. When we hit the limit, it's just their option to trade is shut off. They get some kind of warning, and that's it. And presumably that will piss off the traders, because they might have changed their strategy if they knew they were going to be hit the limit. Or maybe the third situation is that, yes, we do already have warnings, it's just the warnings not at a useful level. Maybe the warning is at 95%, and it's too easy to sort of jump from that to 100%, so it doesn't really serve as anything useful to change a trader's behavior. So clearly, in the bottom case, it's probably something as easy as changing, a constant from 95 to 80, and the job is done. If it's the middle one, well, then again, most of the work is already done for us, because we already have some concept of understanding what the daily limit is and what our current level is, so it's not that much work to put the extra check in. But the first situation, there's loads of work to do. So just having the whereas currently is something that would provide the qualification for that. We'd get the better sense of what the size and scope of this story is if we elaborated, put the appropriate phrase for each of those three possibilities as an extra phrase on the story. Okay, well, I think that's getting to the time box. So if you want to have a story structure, as I say, the original advice still stands. Find the structure that works for you, but try this out and see if it helps. So I say start your why phrase with something that is an improvement to something that somebody already does. So a very common thing that I find here is saving time. I find that's one of the sort of more generic and more sort of unarguably valuable things to do is if your system helps somebody achieve some job they have to do and you can find ways to make them get that job done quicker, they're going to find that valuable. So saving time is certainly a common why part on my stories. For the who part, for somebody, make it somebody who matters. So it's any stakeholder, but also be specific about this person. Okay, so put in some adjectives that help to personify or clarify who really is benefiting from this. Because in many stories, we're doing something that helps somebody. It might be that somebody else sort of compromises or somebody else doesn't benefit. You'll see many stories that say, as a user, I want this. Well, in my experience, it's rare that stories do help all users equally. So be more specific about who it is that really is benefiting from this. For the what, the phrase I used, we will implement some feature or some behavior. I like to start that phrase with a verb and make the verb state the thing that the system should do that it doesn't do at the moment. So that verb that you put in there will be very explicitly about we need to do this, whereas at the moment we don't do this. So choose that verb carefully. And as I say, add a whereas currently if that's helpful to you. It won't necessarily be helpful in all situations, but it does help sort of to clarify help make the implications of your solution brought into some sharper focus. So yeah, choose that when it helps draw that distinction. Okay, there you are. that's the last build. I've got one closing slide, but I was going to allow for any questions at this point, if there are any. The back was first, and then I'll come to you. Thanks. So firstly, I think having the story title distinct from this phrase is a good idea. I do support that. So it's if you invest time in getting this sentence right, then you generally don't optimize for it being short. Whereas a good story title should be short because it wants to be memorable and you want to be able to refer to it. And what you absolutely don't want is people to start talking about the JIRA ticket number instead of the story name. So a good short title has enormous value in addition to this this more complete, if you like, phrasing. The challenge, however, is that what you'll find is that the story title might change as your understanding of the story changes. So don't be afraid to rename your stories or retitle them as your understanding bottoms out. But yes, do choose a title different to this. It probably will. Sorry, I'll put that back up. My titles end up being a phrase similar to this. Other people argue that, well, no, the story should always be that bit. The problem is that that bit isn't always unique. You could have several stories that are about improving, reducing trading time or something like that. And each of them will be a different solution. Therefore, people find it easier to name the solution here. And that's why I say you might eventually get to a name having understood this is the best solution after all the options we considered. And therefore, your first name won't necessarily, your first title for the story won't necessarily be the final one. Okay, and there was one here.
Yeah, jobs to be done. Have you played around with that?
I can't claim familiarity with it, no.
I mean, I know a little bit about it, but I know people are writing user stories based on that. So it's kind of similar in that you're looking at the problem space and what problem your product service, the story is actually looking to address. So.
Yeah. And exactly, and all of these product canvas type tools will, I'm seeing good ideas for how to structure problem statements from those, and many of those carry nicely into, this is how I might name my stories. Also, I think, it's fine to have different styles for naming bigger chunks of things versus small stories I might want to take into a sprint backlog. So, I bagged the as I want so that, although that's not a bad structure for high-level stories, I find. When I really do want to do some product analysis and say, what do my customers really want, then being able to describe those things in the first person works, but usually the thing that you're talking about, your solution, is actually quite a large area of work to be done and not suitable to take into a sprint backlog. So I go for this more specific, okay, here's a very targeted, short-term, minor thing I can do now. I think that this style of naming is more suited to that sprint level backlog item, but other styles might be useful for representing items that are at higher levels of abstraction. So yeah, by all means, choose different styles for different purposes. Okay, I think that's my time box, so I'm going to say thank you very much. I did advertise the book, but it's not to make money because you can have a free copy. So if you follow that URL, you can go to LeanPub and that'll let you download a complimentary copy of 50 Quick Ideas to Improve Your User Stories. So, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.